The silence began long before she stopped speaking. It was the kind of silence that doesn't fall between words but beneath them, a silence that unsettles, that strips language of its power to persuade. He mistook it for distance, but it was not absence, it was awakening. When a woman stops explaining, a man hears the echo of his own ego. He could feel it, though he could not name it, that strange collapse of certainty when the mirror no longer reflects back the hero he imagined himself to be. For years, her words had cushioned him. They soothed the small fractures in his self-image. Every reassurance she offered was a quiet act of submission. Every attempt to be understood was a confession of her own unconscious need to be chosen. She wanted love. He wanted validation. But underneath, both were driven by the same hidden hunger, to be seen without the burden of seeing themselves. He believed her silence was punishment. It was not. It was initiation. In the Jungian sense, silence is not passive. It is the withdrawal of projection. When the anima, the feminine image within the male psyche, no longer finds expression through the outer woman, the man confronts himself. His confidence begins to tremble, not because she has left, but because she no longer carries his unseen self. The moment she ceases to serve as his reflection, the structure of his identity begins to fracture. He confuses this collapse with betrayal. But what breaks is not trust, it is illusion. The male ego depends on recognition to survive. It feeds on being admired, needed, or opposed. Even conflict can sustain it as long as there is a response. Her silence removes the battlefield. It denies him the drama through which he defines his strength. Suddenly, there is no opponent, no validation, no sound to confirm his existence. This is the wound of the ego. It fears the void because it cannot control what it cannot name. She too is transformed by this withdrawal. For so long, her energy was spent translating his unspoken emotions, trying to be understood inside a conversation he was never ready to have. She carried both voices, his and hers, and mistook the exhaustion for intimacy. When she stopped explaining, the energy returned to its rightful place. The silence that unnerved him became the space that built her power. But silence, when born from awareness, is not revenge. It is clarity. It is the feminine archetype reclaiming its sovereignty from the role of muse and mirror. She begins to see that her nurturing instinct was not pure compassion. It was also control. The desire to be indispensable is the shadow of love. It keeps her tethered to the illusion that if she can soothe his wounds, she will finally be safe from her own. In withdrawing, she meets her own emptiness. The stillness becomes a mirror not of him, but of herself. And this is where the deeper initiation begins for both. When a man's ego fractures, the unconscious releases its contents with quiet violence. Repressed emotion rises to the surface: shame, dependency, fear of rejection. Beneath his pride lies the wounded boy, unseen and unloved, demanding through dominance what he never received through tenderness. The moment he can no longer provoke a reaction, he faces the unbearable, his own reflection stripped of power. The silence exposes what words conceal. His identity was never whole. It was constructed through contrast. He was only strong if she was soft, only certain if she was yielding. The polarity that once sustained desire now reveals its dependency. He sees that what he called masculinity was often resistance to vulnerability. What he called leadership was sometimes the inability to listen. And in her stillness, something ancient stirs, the reawakening of the feminine principle, no longer defined by approval or sacrifice. She no longer seeks to prove her worth through empathy that depletes her. She learns that understanding without boundaries is not love, it is self-erasure. In Jungian terms, she begins to integrate her animus, the inner masculine energy that gives her voice, direction, and structure. It is not rebellion against the man. It is union within herself. The woman who once spoke to be heard now chooses silence as alignment. She does not speak to change him. She embodies what cannot be manipulated: presence. Her silence becomes a mirror for his unconscious. It confronts him with the truth he has avoided. Control is not power. Control is fear disguised as strength. The real power lies in awareness, the kind that sees through patterns without needing to destroy them. He feels her absence as a loss, yet what is lost is not her, it is his projection of her. When she no longer plays the role his psyche wrote, the drama ends. Without the performance, he must meet the emptiness of his own stage. And yet this is not tragedy, it is transformation in disguise. For every ego must die a little before the self can awaken, what he calls. Humiliation is often the threshold of humility. What she calls distance is the space in which her intuition breathes again. Silence is not the end of love, it is the beginning of consciousness. He begins to search for her in the patterns she once made familiar, the messages unanswered, the conversations that now end without resolution. But what he truly searches for is the sound of his own significance, the confirmation that he still matters. The masculine ego, deprived of reflection, often mistakes quiet for rejection. It cannot yet understand that what has vanished is not affection, but illusion. In the absence of her validation, the structure of his self-image begins to tremble. The mind resists what the soul demands: dissolution. His logic tells him she has changed. His pride insists she is cold. Yet beneath these defenses lies a quieter recognition. He no longer knows who he is when she stops believing in the version he performed. Silence becomes the mirror where his shadow first takes form. He begins to sense the weight of his own unconscious, the arrogance that masked insecurity, the confidence that hid the fear of irrelevance. Every relationship is a projection until awareness breaks it open. The qualities he accused her of, emotional volatility, withdrawal, manipulation, were often the disowned parts of himself, returning in her behavior like ghosts of his own repression. Projection is not deceit, it is self-preservation. The ego must see its inner conflicts as external, or it would collapse under their tension. So he loved her for the light she carried and resented her for reminding him of his darkness. When she offered empathy, he felt powerful. When she demanded it, he felt trapped. His love was not false, it was incomplete. It sought wholeness without entering the unknown. Her silence dismantled that pattern. No longer absorbing his projections, she returned them through stillness. And in that quiet return, something inside him began to stir, not guilt, but recognition. He started to feel the outlines of his own emotional dependency, the craving for attention that hid beneath his composure. It was not that she stopped caring. It was that she stopped carrying what was never hers to hold. In the archetypal sense, the feminine silence is lunar. It does not confront, it reveals through reflection. Under its influence, the masculine psyche must confront its shadow directly, the animus facing its own anima. What was once externalized as her sensitivity now becomes his vulnerability. What he once judged as her moodiness now manifests as his own unsteady emotions. The projection retracts, the mirror turns inward. This confrontation is not moral but evolutionary. The psyche demands integration. Every man carries within him the feminine image, the anima, that links him to feeling, intuition, and soul. When repressed, it distorts into possession, jealousy, idealization, control. When embraced, it becomes his bridge to empathy. Her silence forces him toward that bridge. He can no longer outsource emotion to the woman beside him. He must feel. But the process is brutal in its honesty. The ego, trained to perform strength, resists the descent into vulnerability. He distracts himself with logic, work, conquest, anything that restores the illusion of control. Yet control is the language of fear. It cannot coexist with awareness. The moment he stops trying to win, he begins to see. The woman he believed had abandoned him had only withdrawn from the game. Her silence was not rejection, it was invitation. For her, too, the silence carries weight. She feels the ache of disconnection, the temptation to explain herself, to soothe the tension. But she understands now that every explanation re-enters the loop of ego negotiation. To defend herself would be to reattach the cord she has just cut. The feminine power is not in persuasion. It is in presence. Her stillness teaches her that love without boundaries becomes servitude, and care without clarity becomes self-betrayal. She senses the awakening of her animus, not as the impulse to dominate, but as the inner structure that holds her truth. For years she had spoken from her heart, hoping words could build safety. Now, safety arises from silence itself, from the grounded knowing that she is not responsible for another's evolution. Her compassion no longer weakens her. It sharpens into discernment. And in the tension between them, his confusion and her calm, a new polarity begins to form. It is not built on need, but on awareness. He stands before her, uncertain for the first time. She meets his gaze without urgency. The dynamic that once thrived on emotional exchange now finds itself suspended in something deeper, the quiet recognition that the roles are dissolving. This is the alchemy of relationship. When projection withdraws, consciousness expands. What once bound them in unconscious repetition now releases them into individual truth. The man begins to see the woman not as savior or adversary, but as mirror. The woman begins to see the man not as provider of identity, but as reflection of her inner landscape. Their silence is not emptiness, it is the birth of inner dialogue. The longer the silence endures, the more it transforms its meaning. What began as discomfort becomes revelation. He begins to notice the spaces between impulses, the urge to respond, to defend, to reclaim control. Each withheld reaction becomes a mirror, showing him how deeply his identity depended on resistance. Without the friction of conflict, the ego loses its stage. It starts to disintegrate in the quiet. At first, he mistakes this disintegration for weakness. The masculine psyche, conditioned to equate stillness with defeat, fights to preserve motion. But silence is not the absence of power. It is its refinement. In the absence of reaction, energy reclaims its direction inward. The tension that once fed argument now fuels awareness. He begins to see that what he called confidence was often armor, and what he called passion was sometimes fear of abandonment. Every silence he fills with thought reveals another defense. Rationalization, blame, avoidance. These are the ego's last negotiations before surrender. But something within him is changing. The collapse of the old identity allows the unconscious to speak in symbols. Dreams return. Emotions surface that feel older than language. The anima, once projected onto the woman, begins to re-emerge from the depths, not as an idealized other but as the living pulse of his own feeling nature. He resists it at first. The anima is soft yet unyielding, intimate yet indifferent to control. She calls him to vulnerability, to empathy, to intuition, qualities long exiled to the margins of his masculinity. But as he stops trying to define her, she begins to transform his perception. The world he once saw through conquest now appears through connection. The woman's silence becomes less a wound and more a window, through which he sees himself as he truly is. Fragmented, searching, yet still capable of wholeness. For her, this silence becomes a temple. What once felt like distance now feels sacred. She realizes that her energy is no longer leaking into the need to be understood. Her emotions, once scattered through constant explanation, begin to condense into presence. She feels her own solidity return, not as resistance but as rootedness. The silence teaches her the discipline of containment, the art of holding emotion without collapsing into it. She no longer fears being misunderstood because she no longer depends on being interpreted. Her worth no longer hangs on whether he sees her clearly. The power she once sought through influence, she now embodies through stillness. The silence that once felt like loss becomes a reclamation of attention, of energy, of self. In Jungian language, this is the feminine individuation, the integration of her own shadow, the parts of her that sought to be needed as proof of love. She sees how her nurturing instinct was sometimes a disguise for avoidance, a way to escape the anxiety of solitude. In caring for him, she neglected her own becoming. Now, in the stillness, she feels the raw encounter with her aloneness, not as abandonment, but as truth. The aloneness is not emptiness. It is the field where she meets the self, the archetype of wholeness that transcends gender and identity. In this space, The polarity between masculine and feminine dissolves into a deeper unity. She begins to sense that the real relationship was never between her and him, but between consciousness and the unconscious, the eternal dance within every soul. He begins to glimpse this too. The silence becomes less about her and more about him. He senses that every judgment he cast was a shadow of his own fragmentation. The resentment, the blame, the pride, all were attempts to escape self-confrontation. Now, with no one left to argue against, he meets his inner opponent, the part of him that feels small, unseen, afraid to surrender control. The fight shifts inward, and with it, the possibility of transformation emerges. In moments of stillness, he begins to hear what words had buried, the faint voice of conscience, the quiet intuition that precedes understanding. Awareness starts to replace reaction. Compassion begins to replace defense. This is not enlightenment, it is dismantling. He realizes that love was never lost, it was distorted by fear. And fear was never conquered, it was merely disguised as dominance. She watches his evolution without attachment. Her silence is no longer strategy, it is respect. She understands that each must meet their own shadow in solitude. No amount of dialogue can substitute for that confrontation. She no longer waits for him to awaken, but her presence, calm, grounded, unwavering, becomes the light that shows he can. Between them, the field has changed. There is N. No longer pursuit and retreat, no longer teacher and student. Only two mirrors facing each other, reflecting, revealing, transforming. The silence has burned away the illusions that bound them. What remains is not romance or rivalry, but recognition. For the first time, he feels the weight of his own inner world and does not run. For the first time, she feels her strength and does not hide. The silence that once separated them now connects them through awareness. He starts to understand that silence is not an absence of communication, but its highest form. Words had always been his weapon and his shield, the way he bent reality to maintain the illusion of control. But silence, her silence, stripped away his narrative authority. It forced him to confront not her version of events, but the emptiness beneath his own. In that void, he begins to feel the weight of something long buried, the truth that power built on dominance is a fragile imitation of wholeness. He recalls moments where he spoke not to connect, but to win. Every explanation disguised a plea for affirmation. Every argument masked the fear of being unseen. He realizes now that his intellect, once so sharp, was often an instrument of avoidance, a way to dissect emotion rather than feel it. This recognition doesn't shame him, it humbles him. The mind that once ruled now kneels before the mystery of what it cannot control. The silence becomes the crucible where his ego dissolves. Without constant affirmation, his worth feels suspended, undefined. But slowly, something else begins to take form, a quiet inner voice untouched by validation. It does not demand to be right. It does not seek to be understood. It simply observes. This is the beginning of consciousness, the witness emerging from the ruins of persona. For her, silence no longer feels like withdrawal. It feels like alignment. She realizes that what she once called love was often a negotiation of energy, giving until empty, explaining until invisible. Now she understands the sacred difference between expression and leakage. She no longer spills emotion in search of relief. She lets it move through her without attachment. This detachment is not coldness. It is maturity, the kind that loves without losing itself. In her stillness, the archetype of the queen begins to rise. Not the fragile sovereignty built on superiority, but the grounded authority that emerges from integration. The queen does not chase or retreat. She holds space with presence. She recognizes that compassion without discernment breeds dependency, and silence without awareness becomes suppression. Her power lies in the balance between empathy and boundary, between softness and structure. She observes him without judgment, not as an adversary, but as a man in the middle of initiation. The masculine spirit, when stripped of projection, must confront its own emptiness before it can become whole. What looks like collapse is often sacred deconstruction. His anger, his confusion, his longing, All are the psyche's way of dismantling false identity. In Jungian psychology, this stage is the meeting with the shadow, the confrontation with everything the conscious mind rejects. The shadow is not evil, it is exiled life force. Each time he denied vulnerability, he exiled tenderness. Each time he avoided emotion, he buried intuition. Her silence does not create his pain, it reveals it. The more he resists it, the louder the unconscious speaks. At night, his dreams begin to shift. The images are no longer about conquest or control. They are filled with symbols of descent, falling, drowning, being chased through dark corridors. These are the psyche's metaphors for transformation. The descent is not punishment, it is purification. The man who emerges from the underworld is never the same as the one who entered. And she feels it not through words but through the subtle resonance of energy. His presence begins to soften. The sharp edges of his speech, the defensive tension in his body, the restless need to be right, all begin to loosen. He starts listening, not for her agreement but for understanding. His silence no longer feels heavy with ego, it begins to breathe with awareness. The polarity between them shifts once again. It is no longer the dance of domination and submission, but of reflection and respect. He no longer fears her silence because he has found his own. The masculine within him begins to integrate the feminine, emotion, empathy, intuition, and the feminine within her integrates the masculine, clarity, direction, sovereignty. This is not balance through equality, but through complementarity. Each has reclaimed the half they once projected onto the other. They do not return to the old dynamic, for it no longer exists. What stands in its place is something quieter, more profound. A meeting of two beings who no longer need to complete each other because they have begun to become whole. He sees her now, not as reflection, not as mystery to solve, but as a sovereign consciousness. She sees him, not as protector or oppressor, but as a soul in process. Their silence is no longer tension, it is communion. But such peace is fragile. The ego does not vanish in one revelation. It lingers waiting for weakness, for the moment attention drifts back to fear. And yet, each time awareness returns, it returns deeper. Each encounter with the shadow refines the light. The silence has done its work. It has broken his ego and built her power, not by opposition, but by revealing the truth beneath both. He wakes one morning and notices that the silence no longer feels like a wall. It has shape, tone, presence, like a living field surrounding everything unsaid. He senses her energy even when she is not near. But it is not possession, it is resonance. What once felt like absence now feels like truth uncluttered by noise. He realizes the ego was never afraid of losing love. It was afraid of losing control. Control had been the disguise of safety. Every opinion, every reaction, every insistence on being understood was a fortress against the unknown. But in the quiet aftermath, he discovers that what he called safety was confinement. The walls that protected him also imprisoned him. Silence became the key that opened them. He begins to understand how projection had ruled their love. He had seen in her what he could not yet claim within himself: sensitivity, receptivity, emotional depth. He had both desired and resented these qualities, for they reminded him of his own denied nature. When she expressed emotion, he saw chaos. When he suppressed it, he called it strength. Yet now, stripped of the drama, he begins to feel. And in that feeling, he discovers the first glimpse of freedom. Emotion once feared becomes sacred information. Every wave of sadness, every pulse of anger is a message from the unconscious asking to be known. The ego calls them threats, the soul calls them guidance. Awareness transforms reaction into relationship, the relationship with one's inner world. For the first time, he no longer seeks to master her or himself. He begins to listen, not to win, but to witness. The masculine spirit in its maturity does not conquer emotion, it learns to contain it. Containment is not suppression. It is presence strong enough to hold chaos without collapsing. That is the masculine in its highest form, not a shield, but a vessel. And it is in this vessel that the feminine can reveal herself fully. For her, the silence has completed its circle. It began as protection, became transformation, and now breathes as peace. She has learned that her power was never in persuasion, never in being chosen, never in being right. It was always in awareness that does not need to defend itself. The woman who once gave endlessly now gives with precision. The empathy that once drained her now flows as discernment. She no longer seeks to fix him, nor to save him from himself. She has learned that rescue is the shadow of control, the illusion that love can replace awareness. Her compassion no longer rushes to fill the silence. It respects it as sacred territory. Every moment of not speaking becomes an act of faith, faith that what is real will endure without her interference. The archetype of the queen within her now stands beside the inner warrior, both balanced, both awake. Her feminine receives truth without fear. Her inner masculine protects her clarity without aggression. This union within her radiates outward, shifting how he perceives her. She no longer appears as his reflection or his refuge, but as his equal, whole unto herself. He feels it, and something ancient inside him bows, not submission but reverence. The same silence that once humbled him now guides him. He begins to understand what Jung called individuation, the journey of integrating opposites, of becoming one's full self beyond the masks of gender, ego, or role. What he once resisted in her, he now recognizes as his missing half. What she once gave him, she now offers through presence, not need. They speak again, but the words are different, slower, fewer. Each carries the weight of consciousness. There is no longer the race to be heard, no longer the fear of silence between sentences. Their communication has become an exchange of awareness rather than defense. Even disagreement feels sacred now because it reveals rather than conceals. They have stepped beyond romance into recognition, the stage where love matures into understanding. This is not the fiery beginning, nor the bitter end, but the middle ground where souls meet without projection. It is the field beyond roles, where polarity serves awakening rather than attachment. He realizes that her silence was never a weapon, it was the sound of truth approaching. She realizes that his struggle was never malice, it was the ego's cry before surrender. Together, they stand at the threshold of a deeper intimacy, one that does not need certainty to feel safe. Because when awareness replaces reaction, love no longer fears silence. In that stillness, they both hear the same quiet revelation. She never broke his ego. His ego broke itself against the mirror of her calm. He never built her power. Her power was always there, waiting for her to stop explaining. Now there is no pursuit, no withdrawal, no lesson to teach. Only two souls who have seen themselves through the other and remembered what they were before they forgot. The silence remains, not as a gap between them, but as the space where consciousness breathes.